Welcome back to Bisexual Killjoy, the place where we know bisexuality isn't a phase, it's a phenomenon. I'm Bailey, and this is
Lynn.
In our last installment, we talked about how bisexual visibility is no longer enough, and that the only way the bisexual and greater LGBTQ plus movements are going to get anywhere new is if for bisexuals, bi+ folks to be recognized as the large and legitimate part of the queer community that it is. In today's episode, The Myth of Passing Privilege, we'll talk about one of the biggest criticisms that bi+ folks, particularly cisgender bi+ folks, get from the queer community. And I know that we're going to get some backlash from this episode. I encourage the conversation. Biphobia really needs to be called out for what she is, and that's what we aim to do today. But before we take that necessary plunge, Lynn, what was your bisexual killjoy moment this week?
So my bisexual killjoy story this week is a little sad. It's a little disappointing. Last semester, I was co-teaching LGBT activism and resistance in the 21st century. And for this particular class, we had speakers come in every week to address the ways in which we and our students could practice activism and resistance. And there were so many different leaders on so many different topics and areas, and it was a true experience and privilege to be in that classroom. However, it was during one of these speakers' visits that I experienced arguably the most uncomfortable interaction regarding LGBT topics. This speaker in particular was a political activist. She studied communications and actively works on campaign trails for progressive candidates with a stunning success rate. She's a lesbian and did a lot of LGBT activism a few years ago. Her entire talk focused on the importance of voting and creating lasting generational change by building coalitions across age groups. She spoke about the difficulties in leading a movement with leaders who did not want to step down and those who were rising up and not wanting to listen to the experience of those who came before them. I was unsure at what to say, what to ask during the Q&A portion, but eventually I did come up with a question. So, bi+ spaces are in the state of, I like to call it morivivi.
Stop. What do you mean?
Okay, so morivivi, to give some short amount of context, is a plant that grew around my hometown. And the second that you touch its leaves, it'll just kind of shrivel up as if it's dying. And then when you leave it alone for a while, it'll come back to life. So bi+ spaces tend to burn and rise with a fire, a passion that moves us to do these amazing things. And shortly after, because of lack of funding or volunteers or resources, they disappear.
So real. That's so real.
And it breaks my heart. And someone who wants to find bi+ community finds a trail of whatever organization was before, and they restart the organization. It begins again. You know, we light up, we go, and then something happens. We don't have the funding, we don't have the leadership, we die. So I explained this to our speaker, and I asked, what should we do to maintain leadership? Any tips to make sure that we can keep this bi+ movement going forward? I didn't really get the answer I was looking for. There were a few sentences of her explaining the importance of current leaders taking current emerging activists under their wing, and then her response took a sharp turn. She spoke about how bisexual people, especially bisexual women, directly benefit from straight passing privilege, that I needed to understand that it was lesbians who did all the heavy lifting in queer history. Bisexual people can't be queer activists because we reap all the benefits from straight passing privilege that we can, quote, blend in. She said that was why lesbians and gay men were the ones at the forefront, especially when lesbians were the ones caring for gay men during the AIDS crisis. Bisexuals needed to make space, she said, for those who have been there from the very beginning. As I'm telling this story, I want to tell you and I want to tell all of our listeners that I spoke up, that I told her the story of how bisexual people were actively nursing and helping our fellow LG folks during the AIDS crisis. I want to tell you that I called her out for actively and violently reading me and my gender without ever bothering to ask me what my pronouns were. That wouldn't really be the truth. The truth is that as she said all of this, I froze. I grew stiff as she related how bisexual people can't be activists because we directly benefit from straight privilege, whatever that means. I dissociated as she read me as a woman who didn't know enough LGBT history to understand what lesbians went through. It was only in the discussion portion of the class a few days after, when a student recounted the event for me as a viewer, that I was actually able to remember what happened in some detail. And it was only when she asked me how I felt that I was actually given the chance to check in with myself and say the truth. Like, I had never been actively and violently read like that.
Welcome to the podcast, everybody. Okay. I promise that we are going to talk about passing privilege today. But before I can even define that for y'all, I need to admit that I am dumbfounded. I am the meme. The woman was too stunned to speak. That lady really said that with her whole chest, huh? First of all, I am so sorry that happened to you. Second of all, fuck her. We might as well, third of all, I think it's really funny when... Not funny, haha, but
funny,
when activists discredit parts of their own community for not being OG when they themselves are not OG. I assume that this person was not old enough to be at Stonewall.
I don't know.
Oh, well, perhaps she's aged very well. But, if we really want to talk about the AIDS crisis, then let's talk about the thousands of bisexual men who died from the virus. And if you write us and hit me with that smarty pants emoji and say, well, actually, according to the data, very few bisexual, I'm going to respectfully tell you to shut the fuck up because the data does not exist. Because no one was counting the bisexuals in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They were lumped into the gay men populations. And much like the tree that falls in the forest, just because you're not asking someone if they're bi doesn't mean that they aren't. And I think that sentence implies that I think trees are bisexuals. And, maybe I do, but...
Some of them are. Some plants are bisexual.
Yeah, some plants are bisexual. At any rate, lesbians weren't the only people in the AIDS wards and in the ACT UP demonstrations. There were plenty of allies in those spaces, and I assure you, plenty of them were bisexual. Statistically speaking, probably a lot of them were bi. For someone, particularly a person with power, to disregard bisexuals and tell them to sit the fuck down because they can blend in is so blasé and frankly dangerous. How ironic for her to tell you to be quiet when silence equals death, huh? I swear the people who wear those fucking shirts are the ones who are hoarding power, the ones that want to gatekeep power and don't actually want to help the other younger activists behind them rise up. And meanwhile, disregarding as many vulnerable groups and populations as they possibly can. Heated. It's too early to be this heated.
I'm hearing you get angry, and I'm actually a little jealous, I'm not gonna lie, because I wanted to start this rant by getting angry. I wanted to be so pissed off at everything that happened in that moment in time and since then. And everything that we have covered on this podcast and are going to cover on Bisexual Killjoy is very near and dear to my heart, to both of us, as a scholar, as a bisexual person. That said, the work isn't always going to be fueled by rage, determination, or grit. Sometimes it's just disappointment. Sometimes it's just sadness.
That's honest. Unfortunately, a lot of the work we do as bi+ advocates is just starting from square one, convincing people or trying to convince people that we exist. As a bi person who has been out for a decade but only has recently gotten involved in LGBTQ+ spaces, I've been mostly surprised by the poor treatment I've received from queer people themselves. And the thing I bump up against the most is this myth of passing privilege.
It's a hard myth to bump against because in some ways it feels true. It feels like monosexuals have a point. It feels like the LGs have a right to resent us, that maybe we shouldn't step into their spaces. After all, monogamous bisexual people are far more likely to end up with someone who doesn't share their gender identity.
And if that's the case, are we queer enough?
This kind of imposter syndrome is tough, but you're not alone. I know that I'm here with my emotional support, Bailey, who understands that I didn't feel the cause that day when I froze up. I was faced with a kind of violence that I didn't know how to handle at the time. And it's okay if there are moments when you don't know how or have the strength to be a bisexual killjoy, because the movement is all of us, the collective. You can take a sick day. You can take a what the fuck just happened day, because everyone is here to help you out and pick up the slack on those days.
And that's exactly how you push back against the bi burnout that you were talking about and trying to find bi community. They're constantly falling apart because there are so many of us that do too much too quickly because there are so many holes in the wall that we're trying to plug, right? And that's exhausting. For our listeners today who didn't get the chance to join us on our last episode, in which we tackled the importance of decentering awareness and visibility in order to make space for what I would term the next part of the plot, recognition and action. As bisexual people, we occupy this liminal space that's easily dismissed. But our fluid experiences encompass more than just desires. Bisexuality isn't just about sexuality, isn't about sexual desire. And the bisexual agenda demands more than just the awareness that bisexuality exists. We demand, our list of demands in our bisexual agenda, is to be recognized as a state of being, as an option, a whole fluid sexuality with a multiplicity of experiences and manifestations. And we need our allies to take action and donate to bi-specific groups, organizations, literature reviews, research studies, etc., etc., etc.
We've mentioned previously that bisexual people are erased, and there are many, many reasons for that, which may or may not include a secret monosexual council meetings to erase bisexuality from the collective knowledge. But today, we're challenging a specific myth that comes up a lot as a reason to erase bisexual folks: passing privilege.
Now you might be sitting there or walking around and saying, what does it mean to pass? And there are so many definitions out there, right? But the one we're using today, we're exploring passing and covering. Now, in the references, we'll link the 2024 Nelson article, but here's the gist. Passing is moving through situations without disclosing one's identity, whilst covering is the act of engaging in normalizing behaviors despite having revealed a stigmatized identity. The ability to pass is determined by how others might, keyword, might understand us, as well as the choices one might make relative to one's external presentation.
So what is straight passing privilege? Well, it's mostly a series of claims made by LG people along the lines of bi+ people in heterosexual relationships do not experience discrimination. The claim that bi+ people, most often women, will leave someone of the same gender for someone of a different gender, suggesting that bi+ people do not value their same gender relationships or are really straight. Bi+ people have heavier onus on them to fight for LGBT+ rights, given their stronger, quote-unquote, social position, suggesting that bi+ people do not experience oppression or discrimination comparable to LGBT people.
Number one, what does onus mean?
Pressure.
No. Okay, so onus means pressure. Great.
Yeah.
The general sentiment that persists is that bisexual people are less likely to experience the kinds of hardship LGBT+ people experience, so they should or should not. And we're going to fill that blank in with stuff like,
they should leave our queer spaces alone.
They should not speak at all for the queer community.
They should not say that they're queer.
They should not pretend that cuffing their jeans or listening to Lana Del Rey will make them queer.
So, Bailey, what was the first time that you heard about straight passing?
I think the first time I heard about it was at a queer event in Boston in which somebody, a gay man, didn't believe me when I said I was bisexual because I didn't look bisexual. And when I looked around the room, I recognized that I wasn't dressed very queerly. I think I was in, black dress that I'd maybe worn to work. I had some red lipstick on and my hair wasn't dyed. And that was enough to have a stranger assume that I was straight. Like I got clocked as straight, even though I am not straight. So I later learned the definition of straight passing in some less than kind Reddit threads about how bisexual women are liars. And I didn't have the words for straight passing privilege until I went back to grad school and started talking to other bi+ people. And I was fucking gobsmacked. Like, how is it a thing? I mean, do you even think that it's real or true?
I think I did at first. I think I just existed in that whole, what did she just say? Referring to my earlier story. Fully incredulous, I've made a really big effort to surround myself with people who are supportive of all aspects of myself. And an LGBT class was the last place that I thought I would be read and accused that hard. I've fallen in love with people of all genders, and during my romantic relationships with men, I was often accused of betraying the cause too. The feminist cause, the LGBT movement. I think that when enough people say that to you, you start believing it. And it doesn't have to be loud. Excluding bisexuals from queer spaces, not allowing us to serve on boards. The silence speak volumes. And it took me a really long time to say, this doesn't sit right, and there is a reason why. It's because it's not true.
Yeah, and I think that silence you mentioned perpetuates the myth of straight passing. But I'm sitting here in my closet wondering what makes it a myth.
Well, the myth fails to account for the reason why bi+ people may be passing as straight. Due to invisibility, misinterpretation, safety, that leads bi+ people to be misunderstood or to cover their identities to, quote, pass through unencumbered.
I think specifically for bi+ folks, passing privilege is a myth because everyone can pass in one context or another. Passing is about how others actively read you, not about how you identify.
Passing always comes at the expense of being in the closet, not being recognized, and not being considered.
Framing passing as a privilege actively ignores the intersection of various oppressions that make passing even possible. You've got heteronormativity, homonormativity, and mononormativity. Now, before we go even any further about straight passing privilege, I think it's important to underline the fact that we bisexual killjoys do not see lesbians and gays as enemies. As Lynn so eloquently said to me earlier this week, the enemy of the bisexual killjoy and all plurisexuals is the binaries instilled in our core understandings of our social world.
Binary here, meaning hetero versus homosexual privilege / oppression. For the sake of argument, let's take a look at heterosexual privilege. The privilege has everything to do with not needing to think about how your sexual orientation, sexual practices, or identity affect you in any or all areas of your life. This is not to say that you aren't affected by your heterosexuality on a day-to-day basis. So many of our interactions are heterosexually coded, and they're taught to us that way. It's seen as neutral, which enables you to not have to think about it. It's not your fault that you don't see it. You were never meant to see it.
Something I find so interesting about this idea of heterosexual neutrality is that it really proves how baked in heterosexual binaries are in this contemporary timeline. Lynn noted the rise of the bourgeoisie in our show notes as being the root cause of this, but I really do not want to get into that today. So to boil it down, you have this guilty look on your face. To boil it down as much as possible, being sexually attracted to women is masculine, being sexually attracted to men is feminine. Now you're probably wondering, what the fuck do you mean by that?
So think about all of the insults you've heard directed at gay men. Think about all of the insults you've heard directed at lesbians. What do they have in common?
I mean, my mind goes right to sissy versus butch.
Of course, because there's a strong correlation between gender and sexuality, a strong binary correlation. Heteronormative understandings of what a romantic and sexual relationship is meant to be, they're strong. So much so that many LGBT spaces are incredibly heteronormative, especially when we take a moment to look back at early LGBT spaces and people.
I sounded really smart earlier when I was talking about heteronormativity, but I actually need to know what we mean when we say heteronormative.
Okay. So heteronormative, as in the only normal behavior is that which is replicating heterosexual behavior. How can same gender attracted people perpetuate or engage in this kind of behavior? So glad you asked. As I was reflecting on how to talk about this, I remembered a few of my conversations with my first mentor back in Puerto Rico. Shout out to Caraballo if you're listening. And at first, I wanted to study bisexuality in the context of churches and Christianity. A large part due to my own experiences of having to pray the gay away. And I was very excited to talk about, bisexual people are here to disrupt the binary. They're here to disrupt what it is that churches are trying to teach. And my mentor talked me down and he was like, I think that you're going to be very surprised if and when you go to an LGBT affirming church because it is incredibly heteronormative. You'll see lesbian couples and you'll see a butch and a femme lesbian. You'll see the same thing with gay men couples. Somebody is going to take on the role of quote unquote the man. And bisexual people are often going to be actively erased because they eventually choose a side. If they're monogamous and they end up with someone who is of the opposite gender, they're not going to be welcome in that LGBT church anymore. So it got me thinking. Gay men are made fun of for being too feminine and all other descriptors that entails. So their spaces largely focus on embracing femininity. Being a gay man feminine meant leaning into your feelings, being fashionable, being into pop music. To be read as a gay man is to deploy these signaling strategies strategically. On the other hand, lesbian women were made fun of for being too strong, too independent, unsuitable to be wives. So their spaces focused on harnessing that, making critical inquiries, fighting for rights in the workplace, and proving that they could be a provider. To be read as a lesbian woman is to strategically present as masculine.
So in this context, you're suggesting that there are these two unspoken rule books around masculinity and femininity, but that's it, because the patriarchy has most of us convinced that there are only two genders.
Yes, and that kind of heteronormativity plays into hetero and homosexual relationships, whether or not anyone is really aware of it. This is how pervasive these systems of thinking are. Not to overgeneralize, but this was a norm that was really often deployed. Butch women tended to be with femme women, and feminine men tended to be with masculine men. And it's awfully heteronormative of me to say, and I don't like saying it and I don't like reading about it, but it's what's there. LGs have always made an effort to be palatable to the status quo. Homonormativity is a political strategy to assimilate. And don't quote me on this, but I want to say back like 60s, two femme lesbians together, unheard of. These rules were enforced some way or another.
You know, you're bumping up on something else that I've been wrestling with this week. This idea of a butch lesbian or a twink gay man or whatever. It's very queer coded in the sense that you look at someone and kind of sort of know whether or not they're in the alphabet mafia. And here I am sitting in my literal closet with my bangs and my cuffed jeans hanging up on the rack and wondering, is there a way to look queer?
I think that there's a way to look, talk, and walk LG, but not necessarily queer. So-called LGBT spaces are normalizing spaces. That is to say, they are spaces and places where performance and understanding of gender and sexuality are actively regulated and policed. LGs created a culture that they want to perpetuate and preserve. When they argue that bi+ people have straight passing privilege because they can't or aren't read as queer, what they really mean is, you don't look or behave like us, so you can't sit with us.
Well, this comes back to what's known as signaling, right? Which is what people do either consciously or unconsciously to let folks know that we're on the same team, so to speak. We have a whole episode planned around this because I can't let it go. But let's get on the same page right now. Everyone can signal their sexuality in 1,000 different ways, whether it's showing cleavage or showing off your forearms. Most folks are displaying their plumage as proudly as any peacock. For LGs, these signals can be discreet, allowing them to pass around straights, but telling each other that they are in the community. Again, I think I mentioned the Hanky code a couple of episodes ago, but it comes to mind. And if you want to learn more about it, check the resources in our show notes. It's a fascinating history.
But bi+ people have always given off mixed signals because we're always going to be a part of both camps. It's fun and games to say that X or Y thing is very bisexual of us. Wearing purple, frogs, opossums, Doc Martens, kickboxing. But how can we make sure that we're consistently read as bi+?
You know, I'm holding my Doc Marten in my hand right now, but I will let you know as soon as I stop having to come out again and again and again.
Bi+ people don't have heterosexual privilege because they're not heterosexual. Spoiler alert. We don't have the privilege of not thinking about sexuality the same way heterosexual people do. So there is no direct benefit that bi+ people experience from heterosexual privilege. There are ways to be consistently read as queer. Aren't queer themselves, they're normative. They follow a strict set of rules that members of that group are expected to follow. Things that we say are very bisexual are really just, they're quirks. They're fun, exciting, community-building quirks, but they're not normative. Bi+ spaces deliberately lack the strategies used in heterosexual and LG spaces to affirm the place's normative understanding of gender and sexuality.
And this is exactly why, historically, the B's and the T's have been strong friends and allies, despite the cries that bisexuals are transphobic. Cries, I think, that have come from LGs more than anywhere else as a way to create division in the bi+ community, but do not quote me on that. Bisexual spaces have a reputation for being radically welcoming to people. Hell, we use bi+ as an umbrella term for anyone who wants to get underneath it. The only place I've ever heard the term gay plus was on Fox News, and it was not very flattering. Anyway.
Yikes.
So, I've heard that trans and non-binary folks were more likely to be excluded in LG spaces. I cannot personally speak to that because I am a cisgender woman. But I know historically LGs have turned away fellow trans and non-binary folks because they muddied the movement as much as bisexuals did.
That said, we are going to emphasize the enemy of the bisexual killjoy is not our fellow LG comrades. The enemy is the pervasive binaries that are actively enforced.
But, and this is a very hardworking but, thank you very much, it is important to acknowledge that privilege does exist for bi+ people.
Of course, bi+ people can have privilege. We acknowledge that no individual is wholly privileged or wholly oppressed. The kinds of intersections and overlaps that we embody make us unique, and the way we navigate through different social contexts will vary depending on who we are.
For instance, a white cisgender bisexual woman may not be viewed as negatively for her sexuality as a black transgender bisexual woman might be. Bias and bigotry have an intersection. I invite everyone to check out the 2022 paper, An Examination of Attitudes Toward Bisexual People at the Intersection of Gender and Race/Ethnicity, to learn more about this.
That said, passing privilege is a very specific kind of myth that plagues bi+ people disproportionately in a negative way. What makes passing possible is the inherent structural and epistemic erasure we currently face. And that's no privilege. That's oppression.
We may choose not to disclose our sexuality. That is my bi prerogative. And if there's one thing that's come up across all of my work and Lynn's work, it's that bi+ folks who don't disclose their identity do so because they fear for their safety. This is a reasonable reaction and a reasonable response. If you fear for your safety, why wouldn't you hide? Plenty of the plurisexuals I interview in my work talk about the code switching they have to do in order to survive. That might mean closeting themselves to their families, but having this robust queer community that they engage with online. And that is not shameful, it's survival.
For our allies that stuck around today, we hope you took something away from this conversation. Your homework this week.
Try not to make assumptions about everyone you meet. Not everyone's straight, and if someone tells you that they are bi+, believe them.
Call out biphobia and bi-erasure when you see it. You won't be good at this every time, and that's okay. And for our friendly bisexual killjoys, because we do know firsthand how frustrating the myth of straight passing privilege can be, this is what you need to know.
Baby, you are queer.
And you have every right to be an LGBTQ activist.
You belong in every single space that claims to be safe for LGBTQ plus people. You are a part of this community.
It doesn't matter who you have as a partner or your relationship structure. You are bisexual. You are bi+. You are pansexual. You are plurisexual.
You do not need to be the perfect killjoy in order to be a bisexual killjoy. We welcome calling out people in organizations imperfectly. We welcome learning what it is that didn't sit right about an interaction. All activism is imperfect.
And please know that you are not a bad bisexual if you choose not to share your sexuality. That is your choice.
And this is for all of our LGBT plus groups and orgs out there. It's straightforward. And I put ha in parentheses around that because I thought it was funny. But it's particularly for our friends at larger LGBTQ plus organizations like the Trevor Project and GLAAD.
Stop making bisexual people the enemy. By excluding bi+ people from your boards, not setting aside bi+ specific resources, and not hosting bi+ specific groups, you are doing a disservice to over 50% of your community. Bisexual folks, particularly bisexual youth, who often have other vulnerable intersecting identities, need you to do better.
So it's always fun and games to talk about myths, right? And fairy tales. Unfortunately, I don't like the straight passing myth. It's very damaging. As we've discussed here is when we pretend that bi+ people have straight passing privilege, it's to push us out of the queer nest. It's to sort of like send us into the wilderness on our own and to grapple because there's this assumption that bi+ people are going to be okay. Statistically, we're not doing okay. We have high rates of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and attempts. We are more vulnerable to intimate partner violence than our friends in the LG parts of the community. And it's because we don't have the same kind of access to resource because we do not think that we belong in queer spaces because we are told again and again and again, you are straight passing, you do not need resources. Baby, we do. Lynn, do you want to add anything to that?
it's important to mention community. And I think that we come back to this at every episode about the importance of engaging with each other and talking to each other and finding each other. Again, our Instagram is there for you. Please reply to each other in the comments. But straight passing privilege is a myth, and it is a hard myth to understand why it's being perpetuated and how it works. It's important that you surround yourself with people who validate your bisexuality, your plurisexuality, and it is in those spaces that you're going to be able to figure out what it is to feel safe, what it is that you are experiencing, and how to navigate it.
Thank you for tuning into Bisexual Killjoy, where we know that bisexuality isn't a phase, it's a phenomenon. We are so excited for the rest of the season. Releases will be every other Wednesday through June. Before you go, if you haven't seen it yet, our Substack is live and ready for you to read and enjoy. To support our work, you can subscribe to that Substack, follow us on Instagram, rate our podcast, preferably 5 stars, so more people can find us. And we do want to hear from you. We have been hearing from you about what this podcast has meant to you, how it's been validating, how you're happy to find it. Thank you. Keep sharing those stories. Connect with us on Instagram. Connect to us via email at bisexualkilljoy@gmail.com. And until then, keep being a bisexual killjoy.
Stay bisexual and stay strong.